Undercover black billionaire got humiliated and bundled out of high-end jewelry store. He showed up the next day and shocked everyone with board restructuring and put everybody in their place. He ended classism and racism with one strike. Dante Washington could have bought the entire building with his lunch money. Instead, he let them drag him out like a common criminal, all because his skin was the wrong color for their crystal palace. The young woman behind the counter tried to defend him. Big mistake. In their world, black people were supposed to know their place. But tomorrow, everything will change. Because the troublemaker they'd just humiliated owned the company. And the brave woman who'd stood up for a stranger was about to discover what happens when unlimited power meets unfinished business. Some people collect jewelry. Dante Washington collected justice. And he always paid his debts in full. Before I continue with this wonderful story, please do me a favor by subscribing to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Now relax and enjoy the story. The elevator to the 42nd floor of the Meridian Financial Tower moved with the whispered precision that only obscene wealth could buy. Inside, Dante Washington adjusted his worn leather jacket, the kind that had seen too many Chicago winters, and checked his reflection in the polished steel doors. 3 days of stubble shadowed his jaw, and his jeans, though clean, bore the honest creases of a man who wore them because he owned only 2 pairs. To anyone watching, he looked exactly like what he wanted them to see, nobody special. His reflection smiled back with dark eyes that held secrets worth $9 billion. Floor 42, sir. The elevator announced in cultured tones that would have made his Harvard Business School professors proud. Dante stepped into the marble and mahogany cathedral of Washington Industries' executive suite, where oil paintings worth more than most people's houses hung beside floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city of Chicago into a personal snow globe. Mr. Washington. His assistant, James, materialized with the efficiency that came from a 7-figure salary. The board meeting materials are ready for your review. The quarterly reports show. Cancel everything. Dante's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had built an empire from a food truck loan his grandmother had co-signed. I'm going shopping. James blinked. In 5 years of managing Dante's schedule, the word shopping had never crossed his employer's lips. Sir? Jewelry shopping. Dante pulled off his Hermes watch, a gift from a Fortune 500 CEO whose company he'd saved from bankruptcy, and slipped it into his desk drawer. In its place, he strapped on a $20 digital watch from the corner drugstore. I have a feeling today is going to be educational. 40 minutes later and a world away, Jasmine Parker stood behind the pristine glass counter of Rothschild and Associates fine jewelry, her reflection multiplied infinitely in the store's mirrored walls. She polished a display case that already gleamed, her movements precise despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. 2 jobs, night classes for her MBA, and the weight of being the only black face in this temple of privilege had carved lines around her 28-year-old eyes that shouldn't have been there yet. Jasmine. The voice belonged to Mrs. Pemberton, the store manager whose smile never quite reached her pale blue eyes. When you're finished with that case, we need to discuss your schedule. Jasmine's hand stilled on the glass. My schedule, ma'am? The Rothschild family is hosting a private viewing tonight for their most exclusive clients. We'll need someone to work security at the doors, checking invitations, that sort of thing. Mrs. Pemberton's tone suggested she was doing Jasmine a favor. It's additional hours, though I'm afraid we can't offer overtime rates since it's technically auxiliary work. The words hung in the perfumed air like a judgment. Jasmine had a master's degree in business administration, would have it officially in 3 months, and 5 years of experience in luxury retail. She spoke 3 languages and could spot a fake Cartier from across the room. But in Mrs. Pemberton's world, she would always be suitable for checking invitations at the door. Of course, Jasmine said, because her student loans didn't care about her dignity, and her grandmother's medical bills certainly didn't. Wonderful. Mrs. Pemberton's smile sharpened. Oh, and Jasmine, do try to remember that our clientele expects a certain atmosphere. Discretion is so important in maintaining the Rothschild reputation. After Mrs. Pemberton glided away on silent heels, Jasmine caught her reflection in the jewelry case glass. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Baby girl, you got diamonds in your soul, but sometimes you have to let folks think you're wearing costume jewelry until you're ready to blind them with the truth." She straightened her blazer, thrift store, but perfectly tailored thanks to her grandmother's sewing machine, and returned to polishing glass that didn't need polishing. Through the store's massive windows, Chicago's Gold Coast bustled with purpose and prosperity, a world she serviced but wasn't quite allowed to inhabit. The afternoon sun caught the facets of a 3-carat engagement ring in her display case, throwing rainbows across her dark hands. For just a moment, she let herself imagine a different life, one where she walked into places like this as a customer, not an employee whose intelligence was invisible beneath the color of her skin. A delivery truck rumbled past outside, and Jasmine caught sight of its driver, a black man about her age whose easy smile made her think of Sunday mornings and possibilities she'd trained herself not to want. He looked like someone who belonged in her world, not this gilded cage where she performed respectability for people who would never see her as respectable. The store's front door chimed, and Jasmine looked up to see a well-dressed white couple approaching her counter. The woman's eyes swept over Jasmine with the practiced dismissal of someone who had never been dismissed herself. "We'd like to see engagement rings," the woman announced. "Something substantial. Price is no object." "Of course," Jasmine replied, her voice carrying warmth she didn't feel. "I'd be happy to show you our collection." As she unlocked the case, her fingers brushed against the 3-carat ring that had caught the light moments before. Someday, she promised herself. Someday she would be the customer, and no one would question whether she belonged. Do you ever wonder if the universe puts people exactly where they need to be, even when it feels like the last place they want to be? The brass bell above Rothschild and Associates' door announced Dante's arrival with a crystalline chime that seemed to pause mid-note when he stepped inside. The store fell silent in that particular way expensive spaces do when something unexpected disrupts their carefully orchestrated atmosphere. Dante took his time, letting his eyes adjust to the soft golden lighting that made every surface gleam like liquid amber. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across walls lined with safes that probably cost more than most people's houses. The air itself felt thick with wealth, leather and vanilla, and the metallic scent of precious metals that had been polished to mirror perfection. Behind the main counter, a young black woman looked up from helping the white couple he'd noticed through the window. Her eyes met him for exactly 2.3 seconds. He'd learned to count these moments, before flickering away with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd been taught that looking too long was presumptuous. "I'll be with you in just a moment," she said, her voice carrying that careful blend of professionalism and deference that made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. Dante nodded and began browsing, his worn sneakers silent against the marble floor. He could feel the weight of watching eyes, not just hers, but others. The white couple at the counter whose conversation had dropped to whispers. A security guard near the door whose hand had shifted imperceptibly closer to his radio. A blonde woman in a navy suit who emerged from the back office with the predatory elegance of someone accustomed to making problems disappear. "May I help you?" The blonde woman's voice could have cut glass. Her nameplate read Mrs. Pemberton, manager, and her smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. "Just looking," Dante replied, his voice deliberately casual as he examined a display of men's watches. Each piece cost more than his food truck had earned in its first year, but he kept his expression neutral. "Nice selection." Mrs. Pemberton's smile tightened. "I'm afraid our timepieces start at $15,000. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the Patek Philippe Nautilus." Dante's finger tapped the glass above a watch he could buy without checking his bank balance. "Retail's about $32,000, right? Though I heard the wait list is over 2 years. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Mrs. Pemberton's carefully composed mask flickered, revealing something uglier underneath. The white couple had stopped pretending to examine rings, and were now openly staring. Even the security guard had taken a step closer. But it was the young woman behind the counter whose reaction hit him like a physical blow. Jasmine, he could see her nameplate now, was watching him with an expression he recognized because he'd worn it himself. The careful hope of someone who wanted to believe, but had been disappointed too many times. "Sir," Mrs. Pemberton's voice had acquired an edge sharp enough to draw blood, "I'm going to have to ask if you have any intention of making a purchase today." The question hung in the perfumed air like an accusation. Dante felt that familiar fire kindle in his chest, the same flame that had driven him from South Side food trucks to Fortune 500 boardrooms. But this time it burned differently, because he wasn't just feeling it for himself. "Actually," he said, his voice still conversational, "I was hoping to look at engagement rings. Something special. Money's not really an issue." Mrs. Pemberton's laugh was like ice cracking. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is Rothschild and Associates. Our engagement rings start at $50,000 and go up considerably from there. Perhaps you'd find something more suitable at the mall." Dante finished for her, and his smile could have melted steel. "What are you going to say?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mrs. Pemberton's composure was fracturing in real time, revealing the ugly assumptions that had been lurking beneath her professional veneer all along. "I think," she said, her voice now openly hostile, "that you should leave." "Ma'am." Jasmine's voice cut through the tension like a bell. She'd moved closer to the counter, her dark eyes flashing with something that might have been anger or might have been recognition. "Perhaps I could show the gentleman our collection? It's my job to assist customers." Mrs. Pemberton turned on Jasmine with the fury of someone whose authority had been questioned in front of witnesses. "Miss Parker, I believe I made myself clear about maintaining appropriate standards." "What standards?" The words left Dante's mouth with quiet precision. "The standard that assumes a black man in jeans can't afford your jewelry? Or the standard that assumes the only black woman in your store should know her place?" The air in Rothschild and Associates had turned electric, charged with the kind of tension that precedes lightning strikes. Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone pale, except for 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. The white couple had backed away from the counter, as if proximity to the conversation might contaminate them. But Jasmine was looking at Dante like he'd just said something she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. "Security," Mrs. Pemberton snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "Please escort this person from the premises. Immediately." The security guard, a mountain of a man who probably moonlighted as a bouncer, approached with the confident swagger of someone who'd done this before. His hand was already reaching for Dante's arm when their eyes met. What the guard saw there made him pause for just a moment, long enough for Dante to speak words that would change everything. "Tell me," Dante said, his voice carrying absolute calm in the face of the storm gathering around him, "does the Rothschild family know how their employees treat potential customers? Because I have a feeling they're going to be very interested in today's customer service." The guard's hand closed around Dante's bicep with unnecessary force. "Time to go, buddy." As they marched him toward the door, Dante's eyes found Jasmine's one more time. In that look, he saw everything he needed to know. She was worth fighting for, this place was worth changing, and tomorrow was going to be very, very different. The brass bell chimed his exit like a funeral dirge, but his smile promised resurrections. The silence that followed Dante's forced exit felt like the aftermath of an explosion, heavy, disorienting, and thick with the smoke of something irreversibly damaged. Jasmine stood frozen behind the counter, her hands pressed flat against the cool glass, as if it could anchor her to some version of reality that still made sense. "Well," Mrs. Pemberton announced, smoothing her navy blazer with trembling fingers, "I think we can all agree that was unpleasant. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, please accept my sincerest apologies for that disruption. Some people simply don't understand their place." The white couple, the Whitmores, exchanged glances that spoke volumes about country club conversations and dinner party anecdotes. Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried the breathless excitement of someone who'd witnessed a scandal she couldn't wait to share. "Goodness, Margaret, how did he even get in here?" Don't you have some sort of screening process? Mrs. Pemberton's laugh sounded like glass breaking. Unfortunately, we can't control who walks through our doors, but we can certainly control who stays. Her pale eyes found Jasmine's reflection in the mirror behind the counter. Can't we, Miss Parker? The weight of that stare made Jasmine's stomach clench. She'd seen that look before, the one that said she was being tested, measured, and found wanting. The look that reminded her she was here on sufferance, a guest in a world that would never truly accept her. Yes, ma'am, she heard herself say, the words tasting like ash. Of course. But even as the words left her mouth, she could still see him, the way he'd stood there with quiet dignity while they stripped him of it piece by piece. The way his eyes had found hers in that final moment, holding something that looked like recognition, hope, the promise of something she couldn't name but desperately wanted to believe in. She tried to focus on the Whitmores, who had returned to examining engagement rings with the renewed enthusiasm of people who'd been reminded of their rightful place in the social hierarchy. But her mind kept drifting to the stranger who'd somehow made Mrs. Pemberton's carefully constructed world feel as fragile as spun glass. 20 minutes later, after the Whitmores had left with promises to think about it and consult their financial advisor, Jasmine found herself alone with Mrs. Pemberton in the store's oppressive quiet. I want to be very clear about something, Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice carrying the particular chill that wealthy white women had perfected over generations. Your little performance earlier was completely inappropriate. In the future, when I ask someone to leave, you will not interfere. Is that understood? Jasmine's hands clenched at her sides. He was just looking at jewelry. That's what customers do. Customer? Mrs. Pemberton's eyebrows rose in perfectly sculpted arcs. Did you see a customer, Miss Parker? Because I saw a troublemaker who clearly had no business in an establishment like this. Your job is to assist legitimate customers, not to enable disruptions. The coded language hung between them like a poisonous fog. Jasmine had heard variations of it her entire life, the polite euphemisms that made racism sound like good business sense. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way he'd spoken about standards, or the quiet authority in his voice when he'd mentioned the Rothschild family. How do you know he wasn't legitimate? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Mrs. Pemberton's smile could have frozen helium. Experience, my dear. 20 years in luxury retail teaches you to recognize certain types. People who belong and people who don't. It's a skill you'd do well to develop if you want to succeed in this industry. And what type am I? The words came from somewhere deep and reckless, from the part of her that had watched her grandmother clean houses for families who couldn't remember her name after 30 years of service. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope. Mrs. Pemberton's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the counter with the rhythm of a funeral march. You, Miss Parker, are the type who should be very careful about biting the hand that feeds her. Especially with your background. My background. As if being black and brilliant and hungry for more was a character flaw instead of a strength. As if her MBA and her perfect sales record and her ability to spot authenticity from across a room counted for nothing against the color of her skin. I understand, Jasmine said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. But Mrs. Pemberton wasn't finished. I've been thinking about your schedule, dear. Perhaps it would be better if you focused on inventory management for a while. Less customer interaction. It might help you develop better judgment about appropriate professional behavior. The demotion hit like a physical blow. Inventory management meant the back room, away from commissions, away from the customers who had come to trust her expertise. It meant being invisible in a place where she'd fought tooth and nail to be seen. Yes, ma'am, she whispered, because her student loans and her grandmother's medical bills left her no choice. After Mrs. Pemberton disappeared into her office, Jasmine stood alone among the glittering displays, surrounded by beautiful things she could admire but never truly possessed. The stranger's words echoed in her mind. Does the Rothschild family know how their employees treat potential customers? There had been something in his voice, a certainty that suggested he wasn't just making empty threats. But that was impossible, wasn't it? He was just another black man who'd walked into the wrong place at the wrong time, another casualty of a system that had been grinding people like them to dust for centuries. Except something about him had felt different. The way he'd known the exact retail price of a $30,000 watch. The calm in his voice when he'd mentioned money not being an issue. The smile he'd worn as they dragged him toward the door, not defeated, but victorious, like someone who knew something the rest of them didn't. Jasmine caught her reflection in the jewelry case glass again, but this time she didn't see her grandmother's costume jewelry metaphor. This time, she saw a woman who had just witnessed something that might change everything, if she was brave enough to believe it was real. The morning sun streaming through Rothschild and Associates' floor-to-ceiling windows felt different somehow. Sharper, more revealing, like stage lights that had suddenly been turned up to expose every flaw in a carefully constructed performance. Jasmine arrived 30 minutes early, as she had every day for 5 years, but this time she lingered outside the mahogany doors, watching her reflection in the glass and trying to reconcile the woman she saw with the woman who had spoken up yesterday. Her phone buzzed. A text from her grandmother. "Baby girl, you sound different in your voice. Something stirring in your spirit." Always knew when something was changing, that woman. Jasmine pocketed the phone and pushed through the doors into the store's golden silence. Mrs. Pemberton was already there, of course, standing behind the main counter like a general surveying a battlefield. Her smile was sharper than usual, all teeth and no warmth. "Miss Parker, I trust you've given some thought to our conversation yesterday." "Yes, ma'am." Jasmine's voice came out steadier than she felt. "About the inventory management position." "Excellent. I've already had the back room prepared for you. You'll find it's quite peaceful back there. No interruptions. No complications." Mrs. Pemberton's pale eyes glittered with satisfaction. "I think you'll find it's exactly where you belong." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Jasmine felt something inside her chest crack. Not break, but develop the kind of hairline fracture that would either heal stronger or shatter completely under pressure. She was halfway to the back room when the brass bell chimed. The sound made her freeze mid-step, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. She turned slowly, half expecting to see him again, the stranger who had somehow managed to plant seeds of possibility in the perfectly manicured soil of her resignation. Instead, she saw Mrs. Gloria Rothschild herself. At 73, the matriarch of the Rothschild jewelry empire moved with the fluid grace of old money and older power. Her silver hair was pulled into a chignon that had probably cost more than Jasmine's monthly rent, and her navy Chanel suit fit with the kind of perfection that could only be achieved by having your own personal tailor on retainer. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, pale blue like winter sky, and sharp enough to cut through pretense with surgical precision. "Margaret," Mrs. Rothschild said, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from owning not just the store, but the building it sat in, and probably half the block besides. "I need to speak with you. Privately." Mrs. Pemberton's confident smile flickered like a candle in a hurricane. "Of course, Mrs. Rothschild. Perhaps my office would be more appropriate. Here it will be fine." Mrs. Rothschild's gaze swept the store like a searchlight, pausing when it reached Jasmine. "You, young lady, come here, please." Jasmine's feet moved before her brain could fully process the command. She found herself standing at the counter between the two white women, feeling like a pawn caught between queens in some elaborate chess game she didn't understand. "What's your name, dear?" "Jasmine Parker, ma'am." Mrs. Rothschild studied her with the intensity of someone appraising a rare gem. "How long have you worked for my store, Miss Parker?" 5 years, ma'am." 5 years. Mrs. Rothschild repeated the words as if they carried special weight. "And in those 5 years, have you ever seen anything that concerned you? Anything that might reflect poorly on the Rothschild name?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Jasmine could feel Mrs. Pemberton's eyes bored into her, and could practically hear the threats that would come later if she answered wrong. Her student loans, her grandmother's medical bills, her carefully constructed life, it could all disappear with the wrong words. But then she thought about yesterday, about the quiet dignity in a stranger's eyes as they dragged him toward the door, about the way his final words had sounded less like a threat and more like a promise. Yesterday, she heard herself say, there was an incident. Mrs. Pemberton's face went white. Miss Parker, I hardly think. Continue, Mrs. Rothschild said, her voice cutting through Mrs. Pemberton's protest like a blade through silk. So Jasmine told her. About the man who had walked in looking for an engagement ring. About the assumptions that had been made based on his appearance. About the way he'd been treated, spoken to, and ultimately removed from the store without ever being given a chance to prove his intentions were legitimate. With each word, Mrs. Pemberton seemed to shrink a little more, while Mrs. Rothschild grew more imposing, not through size, but through the terrible weight of accumulated authority. I see. Mrs. Rothschild's voice could have frozen champagne. She turned to Mrs. Pemberton with the slow, deliberate movement of a predator who had finally cornered her prey. Margaret, is this account accurate? Mrs. Rothschild, you have to understand, we have protocols. Do we? Please, enlighten me about these protocols. Which company manual covers the procedure for assuming a customer's financial capacity based on their race? The silence that followed was so complete that Jasmine could hear her own heartbeat. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air on dry land. Furthermore, Mrs. Rothschild continued, her voice gaining momentum like an avalanche, I'm curious about your decision to demote Miss Parker here for attempting to provide customer service. Is initiative something we discourage at Rothschild and Associates? Ma'am, I didn't mean. Oh, but you did mean it, Margaret. The question is whether you meant to expose this company to the kind of liability that could destroy us. Mrs. Rothschild's smile was the kind that made polar ice caps look tropical. Because as of this morning, I've been in communication with several very concerned parties about yesterday's customer service. Jasmine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had made a phone call. Someone with enough influence to bring Gloria Rothschild herself down from whatever ivory tower she usually occupied to personally investigate a single incident in one of her stores. Miss Parker, Mrs. Rothschild said, her voice suddenly gentle, I'm going to need you to walk me through yesterday's events one more time, in detail, because I have a feeling there's going to be quite a bit of restructuring happening very soon. As Jasmine began to speak, she caught her reflection in the jewelry case glass one more time. But this time, she didn't see costume jewelry at all. This time, she saw exactly what her grandmother had always told her was there. Diamonds, waiting for the right light to reveal their true brilliance. Mrs. Rothschild's office occupied the entire top floor of the building that housed her flagship store, its windows offering a commanding view of Chicago's skyline that seemed to bend toward her like subjects bowing before a queen. But it was the wall behind her desk that made Jasmine's breath catch in her throat. Dozens of framed photographs spanning decades, showing Mrs. Rothschild with presidents, celebrities, and titans of industry. And there, in a place of honor next to a picture with Nelson Mandela, was a photograph that made the world tilt sideways. Mrs. Rothschild and a much younger black man in graduation robes, both beaming at the camera. The man's face was leaner, his eyes younger, but unmistakably familiar. The same quiet intensity, the same dignified bearing that had made him stand out even in worn jeans and a leather jacket. You recognize him, Mrs. Rothschild said, following Jasmine's gaze. It wasn't a question. Jasmine's voice came out barely above a whisper. That's the man from yesterday. Dante Washington. Mrs. Rothschild moved to stand beside the photograph, her fingers tracing the frame with the careful reverence reserved for precious things. My godson. Though I suppose that's not entirely accurate anymore. It's hard to think of someone as a child when they've just orchestrated the most elegant business maneuver I've seen in 40 years. The room seemed to spin around Jasmine. Godson. The word echoed in her mind like a bell tolling, rearranging everything she thought she understood about yesterday's encounter. I don't understand, she managed. Mrs. Rothschild's smile held layers of meaning, like an expensive perfume with notes that revealed themselves slowly. Dante's grandmother and my mother were best friends. Unusual for the 1950s, a black domestic worker and a Jewish jewelry heiress. But Esther Washington and my mother, Ruth, saw something in each other that transcended the social barriers of their time. She moved to another photograph, two women, one black and one white, standing together in what looked like this very office, both wearing expressions of quiet determination. When Dante was 12 and his parents died in a car accident, Esther brought him to me. Not for charity. God knows that woman was too proud for charity, but because she recognized something in him. The same hunger for excellence that had driven my family to build this empire from nothing. Jasmine felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, creating a picture that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. You helped raise him. I gave him opportunities. Harvard Business School. Internships at Fortune 500 companies. Access to networks that would have been closed to him otherwise. Mrs. Rothschild's voice carried the weight of old regrets. But somewhere along the way, I failed him. Failed him how? Mrs. Rothschild turned away from the photographs, her pale eyes reflecting something that might have been shameful. I taught him to navigate white spaces, but I never taught him that he shouldn't have to. I gave him the tools to succeed in a system I should have been working to change. The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy with the smoke of good intentions that had missed their mark. He built Washington Industries from nothing, Mrs. Rothschild continued. Started with a food truck and his grandmother's life savings. 15 years later, he's worth more than $9 billion. And you know what he told me when he called this morning? Jasmine shook her head, not trusting her voice. He said, "Gloria, I spent yesterday remembering what it feels like to be powerless. Today, I'm going to remember what it feels like to use power for something that matters." The words hit Jasmine like a physical force. $9 billion. The number was so large it seemed abstract, unreal. But the memory of his dignity as they dragged him from the store, that was real. The quiet authority in his voice when he'd mentioned the Rothschild family, that made perfect sense now. He could have revealed who he was, Jasmine said, the realization dawning slowly. He could have stopped it at any time. But then he wouldn't have seen who people really were when they thought he was powerless. Mrs. Rothschild's smile was as sharp as a winter wind. Dante has always been strategic, but yesterday he became something more dangerous, a man with unlimited resources and a very clear understanding of exactly who deserves his mercy. Mrs. Rothschild moved to her desk and picked up a thick manila folder. He's calling an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. As majority shareholder in Rothschild Holdings. Oh yes, dear, he bought controlling interest 3 years ago, though we kept it quiet. He has some suggestions about company policy. Jasmine's mind reeled. He owns the company? Majority stake. Though he's been what you might call a silent partner until now. Mrs. Rothschild's eyes glittered with something that might have been anticipation. I suspect his silence is about to end quite dramatically. What does this mean for? Jasmine gestured helplessly toward the store below, toward Mrs. Pemberton, toward the careful ecosystem of prejudice that had governed her working life for 5 years. It means, my dear, that you're about to discover what happens when someone with the power to change everything decides that everything needs to change. Mrs. Rothschild handed her the manila folder. These are the personnel files for every employee in our Chicago locations. Dante specifically requested that you review them before this afternoon's meeting. Jasmine's hands trembled as she accepted the folder. Me? Why me? Because yesterday, when it mattered, you chose to do the right thing even though it cost you. Because you saw him, really saw him, when everyone else saw only what they expected to see. Mrs. Rothschild's voice softened with something that might have been maternal pride. And because Dante Washington doesn't forget people who stand up when standing up requires courage. As Jasmine opened the folder and saw her own personnel file on top, filled with glowing performance reviews, customer commendations, and a note in Mrs. Pemberton's handwriting recommending her for demotion due to attitude problems, she understood that yesterday had been about so much more than a jewelry store encounter. It had been about recognition, about seeing and being seen, about the moment when power and principle finally found each other and decided to dance. The Meridian Financial Tower's 42nd floor boardroom felt like stepping into the heart of power itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the space like crystal armor, offering a panoramic view of Chicago that made the city look like a scale model of ambition. The mahogany conference table could have seated 20, but today it hosted only 4. Mrs. Rothschild at the head, Mrs. Pemberton looking like she'd swallowed glass, a nervous-looking man Jasmine didn't recognize who kept checking his phone, and an empty chair that seemed to command more attention than all the occupied ones combined. Jasmine sat in a smaller chair against the wall, the personnel files spread across her lap like evidence in a trial she was still trying to understand. For the past 2 hours, she'd been reading through employment records that painted a disturbing picture of systematic discrimination disguised as business decisions. Patterns that would have been invisible to someone who hadn't lived them, but which stood out to her like neon signs in the darkness. "He's late," Mrs. Pemberton muttered, her voice carrying the desperate hope of someone clinging to the last threads of her authority. "This is highly irregular. Board meetings should start on time." Mrs. Rothschild's smile could have cut a diamond. "Dante operates on what I like to call dramatic timing. He'll be here when his entrance will have maximum impact." As if summoned by her words, the elevator chimed softly, and Dante Washington stepped into the boardroom. The transformation was breathtaking. Gone were the worn jeans and leather jacket. In their place, a charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, paired with Italian leather shoes that whispered against the marble floor with each step. His presence filled the room like smoke, impossible to ignore and subtly dangerous. But it was his eyes that made Jasmine's breath catch. The same quiet intensity she'd seen yesterday, but now unmasked, undiluted by the need to hide who he really was. When those eyes found hers across the room, the connection hit like lightning, recognition, gratitude, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "Ladies, gentlemen." His voice carried the same measured calm as yesterday, but now it resonated with the authority of someone accustomed to moving markets with his words. "Thank you for accommodating this emergency meeting." He moved to the head of the table, and Mrs. Rothschild gracefully shifted to the seat beside him, a subtle but unmistakable transfer of power that made Mrs. Pemberton's face go ashen. "Before we begin," Dante continued, his gaze sweeping the room like a searchlight, "I'd like Miss Parker to join us at the table. Her insights will be invaluable to today's discussion." Jasmine felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Mrs. Pemberton's expression could have curdled milk, while the nervous man, she'd gathered he was some sort of legal counsel, looked like he was calculating liability settlements in his head. "I don't think that's appropriate," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice cracking like thin ice. "Miss Parker is just a sales associate. This is a board meeting." "Miss Parker," Dante interrupted, his voice cutting through Mrs. Pemberton's protest with surgical precision, "is the reason we're all here today. Her courage in speaking truth to power is exactly the kind of leadership we need to cultivate at Rothschild Holdings." The words hit Jasmine like a warm wind. She stood on unsteady legs and made her way to the conference table, acutely aware of the way Dante's eyes followed her movement. Not possessive or predatory, but protective, as if he was ready to fight anyone who tried to diminish her. "Please," he said, pulling out the chair beside him, "tell them what you found in those files." For a moment, Jasmine hesitated. This was it, the point of no return. She could stay quiet, keep her head down, and hope to survive whatever storm was coming. Or she could trust the man who had willingly endured humiliation to expose the truth about the system they all served. She chose the truth. "The patterns are unmistakable," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Over the past 5 years, every promotion to management has gone to white employees, regardless of performance metrics. Black and Hispanic employees are consistently rated lower on cultural fit evaluations, despite having superior sales numbers. And customer complaints about discrimination are routinely dismissed as misunderstandings." Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone from ashen to crimson. "Those files are confidential. She has no right." She has every right, Dante said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart people reconsider their life choices. As of this morning, Miss Parker has been promoted to Director of Cultural Excellence, reporting directly to me. Her first assignment was to audit our personnel practices. The silence that followed was so complete that Jasmine could hear her own heartbeat. Director. The word echoed in her mind like a bell, rearranging her understanding of what was possible. Furthermore, Dante continued, his attention turning to Mrs. Pemberton like a laser focusing sunlight. Effective immediately, Margaret Pemberton's employment with Rothschild Holdings is terminated. Security will escort her from the building within the hour. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The legal counsel looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Mrs. Rothschild sat back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone watching justice, served with a side of poetry. "You can't do this," Mrs. Pemberton finally managed. "I've been with this company for 20 years. I have contracts, agreements, which included clauses about maintaining company standards and reputation," the legal counsel said quietly, consulting his tablet. "Yesterday's incident constitutes a clear violation of both employment terms and federal anti-discrimination laws." As security appeared at the boardroom doors with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed ballet, Dante turned to Jasmine with an expression that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. "I know this is overwhelming," he said, his voice dropping to a tone meant for her ears alone. "But I need you to know, yesterday, when you stood up for me, you weren't just defending a stranger. You were defending an idea. The idea that people deserve to be treated with dignity regardless of what others assume about them." His hand moved as if to touch hers, then stopped, maintaining propriety while somehow conveying infinite tenderness. "I'd like to take you to dinner tonight," he continued, his formality unable to hide the vulnerability underneath. "Not as your employer, but as someone who wants to know the woman brave enough to risk everything for a principle." Jasmine's heart hammered against her ribs. In the space of 2 days, her entire world had been demolished and rebuilt. But looking into Dante's eyes, seeing the hope there, fragile and precious as spun glass, she realized that maybe some demolitions were actually renovations in disguise. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in her life. The restaurant Dante had chosen was the kind of place where silence cost extra, and every surface reflected money back at itself in endless, glittering loops. Alinia's 3 Michelin stars hung in the air like distant suns, and the 23-course tasting menu unfolded before them with the precision of a Swiss watch and the artistry of a fever dream. But Jasmine barely tasted any of it. For 3 hours they talked. Really talked. Not the careful dance of professional courtesy or the guarded exchanges of people feeling their way around attraction, but the raw, unfiltered conversation of 2 souls recognizing themselves in each other. He told her about nights spent studying by streetlight when the electricity got cut off, about the weight of being the first in his family to graduate high school, let alone Harvard. She shared stories about her grandmother's hands, cracked and scarred from decades of cleaning other people's houses, and the way those same hands had sewn her interview suits with thread unpicked from their own clothes. They talked about the peculiar exhaustion of being excellent in spaces that never expected excellence from people who looked like them, about the way success could sometimes feel like betrayal of your community, your struggle, your authentic self, about the question that haunted them both. How much of yourself could you change before you stopped being yourself at all? It was the kind of conversation that built bridges between souls, and Jasmine had felt herself falling, not just in attraction, but in recognition. Here was someone who understood the weight she carried, the careful calibration required to be black and brilliant and visible without being threatening. And then Dante's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his entire expression shifted, the warmth draining from his eyes like water from a broken dam. "Excuse me," he said, his voice suddenly distant. "I need to take this." He stepped away from their table, but the restaurant's acoustics betrayed him. Jasmine caught fragments of conversation that felt like shards of glass cutting through the evening's magic. "Told you to handle it quietly. Can't have this getting out now. The merger depends on..." When he returned to the table, something fundamental had changed. The man who sat down was still Dante Washington, Billionaire CEO, but he was no longer the Dante who had shared stories about his grandmother's sweet potato pie and the way she used to hum while counting coins for the electric bill. "I'm sorry," he said, not meeting her eyes. "That was business." "What kind of business?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, carrying on the intuition that had served her well in 5 years of reading people's intentions across jewelry store counters. Dante's jaw tightened. "Nothing that concerns," he stopped himself, but the damage was done. The phrase hung between them like a blade. "Nothing that concerns you." Jasmine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Try again." "Jasmine, there are aspects of my work that are complicated. Sensitive. I can't just..." "Can't just what?" "Trust me?" She leaned back in her chair, studying his face with new eyes. "This morning you promoted me to Director of Cultural Excellence. Tonight you can't tell me about a phone call that clearly upset you. It's not about trust." But his voice carried the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself as much as her. "It's about protecting." "Protecting me?" The laugh that escaped her throat was sharp enough to cut crystal. "Dante, I've been protecting myself my entire life. What I can't protect myself from is being treated like a child who can't handle adult conversations." The server approached their table with the next course, some architectural marvel involving foam and edible flowers, but retreated when he sensed the electrical storm brewing between them. The phone call was about the Washington Industries merger with Kellerman Automotive, Dante said finally, his words precise as surgical incisions. "There are complications." "What kind of complications?" "The kind that could destroy everything I've built if they become public." His eyes were distant now, calculating, the warmth she'd seen earlier buried beneath layers of corporate strategy. "The kind that requires careful management and absolute discretion." "And you don't think I can be discreet?" "I think you're idealistic." The words hit like a slap. "I think you believe that doing the right thing always wins in the end. And I think that kind of thinking could cost us both everything." "Us." The word should have been a bridge, but instead it felt like a chasm. Because suddenly Jasmine understood that in Dante's mind, there was him, the billionaire who moved in worlds of calculated compromises, and there was her, the idealistic employee who needed protection from the ugly realities of power. "So what am I then?" Her voice was deadly quiet. "Your project? Your good deed? The black girl you rescued, so you could feel better about the system you profit from?" "That's not..." Dante's composure cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "Jasmine, you don't understand. The things I have to do to maintain this level of influence, the compromises." "Try me." She leaned forward, her dark eyes blazing. "Tell me what's so terrible that you think I can't handle knowing about it." The silence stretched between them like a tightrope. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant ballet of service and consumption, but their table had become an island of tension in a sea of privilege. "The Kellerman merger involves suppliers who use prison labor," Dante said finally, each word falling like a stone into still water. "Predominantly black prisoners working for cents per hour to manufacture automotive parts. It's legal. It's profitable. And it's how I've been able to accumulate the resources to do things like what happened today." The revelation hit Jasmine like a physical blow. Prison labor. Black bodies generated profit for a system that had incarcerated them. The same system Dante claimed to be fighting against. "You knew," she whispered. "All this time you knew. I'm working to change it. The merger gives me leverage to..." "To what?" "Gradually reform a system that's grinding people to dust while you profit from it." She stood so abruptly that her chair scraped against the marble floor like a scream. "You want to talk about protecting me? Protect me from this. Protect me from finding out that the man I thought I was falling for is exactly the kind of person my grandmother warned me about." "Jasmine, please." But she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the restaurant floor with the finality of a judge's gavel. Behind her, she left Dante Washington sitting alone at a table set for two, surrounded by the ruins of what might have been and the bitter taste of what actually was. Outside, Chicago's winter wind cut through her dress like truth through comfortable lies, and Jasmine understood that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt, no matter how much money you threw at the ashes. The silence in Dante's penthouse apartment was the kind that money couldn't buy, the absence of sirens, traffic, and the desperate sounds of people fighting for survival 42 floors below. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the space like a crystal cage, offering a view of Chicago that made the city look manageable, controllable, small enough to hold in the palm of his hand. But tonight, the view felt like an accusation. Dante stood at the window, still wearing his dinner jacket, a tumbler of 25-year-old bourbon untouched in his hand. The amber liquid caught the city lights and threw them back in fractured patterns that reminded him of the way Jasmine's eyes had looked when she realized what he was. Not who he was. What he was. The distinction mattered more than he'd expected it to. His phone sat silent on the marble kitchen island, though he'd stared at it for the better part of 3 hours, drafting and deleting messages that all sounded like variations of the same pathetic theme. You don't understand. Except she did understand. That was the problem. She understood exactly what he'd become in his climb to the top, and she'd looked at him like he was everything her grandmother had warned her about. The worst part was that her grandmother had been right. Behind him, the apartment's silence was broken by the whisper of the elevator doors. Only one person had the access codes to reach his private floor unannounced. "You look like hell," Mrs. Rothschild said, her voice carrying the particular blend of affection and exasperation that only godmothers could master. She moved through his space with the confidence of someone who had helped pick out the furniture, settling into the leather chair that faced the windows. "Also, you're still in your dinner clothes. I'm going to assume the evening didn't go as planned." Dante didn't turn around. She walked out. "I gathered as much when James called to say you'd missed the midnight conference call with the Tokyo investors." Mrs. Rothschild's reflection appeared in the window beside him, her silver hair gleaming like moonlight. "The question is why?" I told her about Kellerman. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Mrs. Rothschild's reflection didn't move for a long moment, but when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old disappointments. "Ah, that's it? Ah." Dante finally turned to face her, and the movement released something he'd been holding back for hours. "Gloria," she looked at me like I was a stranger. Like everything we'd shared tonight was meaningless because of one business decision. Was it one business decision? Mrs. Rothschild's pale eyes held the kind of clarity that came from 7 decades of watching people lie to themselves. Or was it the pattern that decision represents? The question hit like a physical blow. Dante set his bourbon down with the careful precision of a man trying not to break something valuable. "I've never hidden who I am. What should I do?" "Haven't you?" Mrs. Rothschild rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to stand beside him at the window. "Yesterday you went into that store as someone powerless. Tonight, you brought her to dinner as someone powerful. But neither of those men is entirely real, is he?" "I don't know what you mean." "I mean that you've spent so long becoming the kind of man who could change the system that you've forgotten to ask yourself whether you want to be that man." Her voice was gentle, but her words cut like surgical steel. The Dante who built a food truck empire because he wanted to feed people. Where is he in the Kellerman merger? Dante's hands clenched at his sides. That Dante was naive. Idealistic. He thought good intentions were enough to change the world. And this Dante thinks compromise is. This Dante has the resources to actually make a difference. Does he? Mrs. Rothschild's smile was as sharp as a winter wind. Because from where I'm standing, this Dante just lost the one person who reminded him why making a difference mattered in the first place. The words hung in the crystalline air like an indictment. Outside, Chicago glittered with the dreams and struggles of millions of people who would never see the world from this height, never understand the weight of decisions that moved markets and shaped lives from 42 floors above their daily battles. What am I supposed to do? The question came out raw, stripped of the careful control that had defined him for so long. Walk away from everything I've built. Destroy an empire because one woman can't understand the realities of. Of what? Power? Mrs. Rothschild's laugh was like ice cracking. Dante, that woman understands power better than you do. She's been powerless her entire life, which means she knows exactly what it costs and exactly what it's worth. She moved to the kitchen island, picking up his phone with the casual authority of someone who had been family long before biology mattered. The question you need to ask yourself isn't whether Jasmine understands your choices. It's whether you can live with being the kind of man she can't respect. Dante stared at the phone in her hands, seeing his own reflection multiplied in its black screen. For 15 years, he'd made decisions based on strategy, on the long game, on the cold calculus of maximum impact. But tonight, for the first time since he'd learned to think like a billionaire, he found himself asking a different question. What would the man in the food truck do? That man, younger, hungrier, more naive, had believed that feeding people mattered more than profit margins, had thought that building something beautiful was worth more than building something efficient, had never looked at a system of oppression and asked how he could profit from it while working to change it. That man would have walked away from Kellerman without hesitation. She's not answering her phone, he said quietly. Would you? Mrs. Rothschild set the phone down gently. If someone you trusted turned out to be profiting from the very system that had tried to destroy you. The answer was a blade between his ribs. No. Then you know what you have to do. Dante looked out at the city one more time, seeing it not as a kingdom to be managed, but as a collection of human stories. Some triumphant, some tragic, all of them mattering more than the view from his window suggested. Tomorrow, he will call an emergency board meeting. Tomorrow, he would pull out of the Kellerman merger and accept the financial losses that came with choosing principle over profit. Tomorrow, he would begin the long work of becoming worthy of a woman who had looked at him with diamonds in her eyes and seen something worth believing in. Tonight, he would sit with the weight of understanding that some choices couldn't be undone, and some bridges, once burned, required more than money to rebuild. They required becoming someone worth crossing back to. 3 weeks later, Jasmine stood in the back room of what had once been Rothschild and Associates, surrounded by boxes and the ghosts of 5 years' worth of small humiliations. The store was being converted into something new, a community resource center that would offer financial literacy classes, small business loans, and jewelry repair services at cost. The irony wasn't lost on her. The space that had once excluded people like her was being transformed into a place designed to serve them. She was packing the last of her personal items when she heard the brass bell chime one final time. "We're closed," she called out, not looking up from the box of customer thank you notes she'd saved over the years, handwritten testimonials from people who had trusted her to help them choose symbols of their love. "I know." The voice stopped her cold. She'd heard it in her dreams for 3 weeks, had practiced conversations with it in her bathroom mirror, and had imagined all the ways she might respond if she ever heard it again. But now, faced with the reality of Dante Washington standing in the doorway like a question mark in an expensive suit, all her practiced responses deserted her. He looked different. Thinner, maybe, or just carrying weight in places that didn't show. His eyes held something she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that money couldn't buy and power couldn't fake. "The news said you pulled out of the Kellerman merger," she said, because it was safer than asking why he was here, why her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "It cost me about $2 billion. His smile was rueful, self-deprecating. "Turns out my board wasn't thrilled about walking away from guaranteed profit for, what did they call it? Moral grandstanding. $2 billion. The number was so large it felt abstract, unreal. Do you regret it?" "Every day." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. "And not at all. Turns out those can both be true at the same time." He moved deeper into the store, his footsteps echoing in the space that had once hummed with quiet commerce and quieter prejudice. His eyes took in the changes, the community resource center banners, the educational displays about predatory lending, the corner where a legal aid attorney would hold office hours twice a week. "This is beautiful," he said, and meant it. "Whose idea was it?" Yours, actually. Jasmine set down the box she'd been packing, watching his face carefully. Mrs. Rothschild said you wanted to do something meaningful with the space. Something that would actually serve the community instead of just extracting wealth from it. I said that? In the board meeting where you fired half the executive staff and restructured the entire company around what you called radical empathy. She couldn't quite keep the smile out of her voice. It made the Wall Street Journal. Billionaire's moral crisis costs investors billions. Dante's laugh was soft, self-aware. Sounds about right, though I prefer to think of it as a moral awakening. They stood in the comfortable silence of two people who had shared something profound and painful and were still figuring out what remained in the aftermath. Outside, Chicago's afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting everything in the golden glow that photographers called magic hour. I came to apologize, Dante said finally. Not for the business decisions, though those were wrong too, but for treating you like someone who needed protection instead of someone I needed to learn from. Jasmine felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. And what exactly did you need to learn? That being right about the system doesn't justify participating in it. That good intentions without good actions are just another form of self-deception. He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he was trying to become. That the woman who stood up for a stranger in a jewelry store had more courage than the billionaire who spent 15 years convincing himself that compromise was strategy. The words hung between them like an offering. Jasmine studied his face, looking for the tells she'd learned to recognize in 5 years of reading people's intentions across jewelry store counters. But all she saw was honesty, raw and undefended. What happens now? She asked. Now I spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of the faith you showed in me that first day. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made her breath catch. But first, I have something that belongs to you. Inside the box was the 3-carat engagement ring she'd admired that first afternoon. The one that had caught the light and thrown rainbows across her dark hands while she'd allowed herself to dream of a different life. I don't understand, she whispered. The day after our dinner, I bought every piece of jewelry in that display case. This one I bought for you. Not as a bribe or an apology, but as a promise. His voice was steady, but she could see the tremor in his hands. A promise that someday I might become the kind of man who deserves to offer this to you properly. Jasmine looked at the ring, flawless, brilliant, worth more than her grandmother's house, and understood that it wasn't really about the diamond at all. It was about the possibility it represented. The chance that two people who had seen each other at their worst and their most vulnerable might find something worth building together. I'm not ready, she said, and watched something flicker across his face, disappointment maybe, or just understanding. I know. He closed the box gently and slipped it back into his pocket. But when you are, if you are, I'll be here. Building something worthy of you. Becoming someone worthy of you. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway where this had all begun 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. For what it's worth, he said, that woman who stood up for a stranger, she changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who'll walk through these doors and find opportunity instead of judgment. Everyone who'll get a loan instead of a lecture. Everyone who'll be seen for who they are instead of what others assume about them. As the brass bell chimed his departure, Jasmine caught her reflection in the window. Not in a jewelry case this time, but in glass that looked out onto a street where people like her could walk with dignity, build dreams, and know that somewhere, someone powerful was working to make the world worthy of their brilliance. She was still looking at her reflection when her phone buzzed with a text. Dinner tomorrow? I know a food truck that makes the best fish tacos in Chicago. No dress code required. Just come as you are. For the first time in 3 weeks, Jasmine smiled like she meant it. Sometimes the most unexpected love stories begin with someone brave enough to see you. Really see you. When everyone else is looking right through you. What would you risk to be truly seen?